Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello everyone, welcome to the 7th week of this massive open online course on Sociology of Development. We are going to have critiques of modernization theory in terms of 2 lectures. I mean, now we are going to have the 16th lecture of this course, and then we will have 17th lecture. In terms of these 2 lectures, we are going to foreground the critiques of modernization theory. If you slightly recall, we have discussed modernization theory as the first sociological account of development, which postulates that the less developed economy should eventually catch up with industrialized world, provided they emulated the economic and social systems of Western capitalism. As you know, modernization theory is based on the theoretical premises of structural functionalism, that is, society is composed on the basis of complementarity and reciprocity of roles in the social division of labor. Theories of modernization, they try to conceptualize development as a staged transition from tradition to modernity, to be brought about at the economic level, at the social level, and at the political level. Then we have discussed how the modernization theory accorded central role to the state and its public policy, but failed to examine the nature of the state itself, its location within the matrix of a class divided society, and its relationship with contending social forces. And that is how we have discussed how the state is thought of as an entity that stands outside and above society. The state is thought of as an autonomous agency that is invested potentially with an independent source of rationality, enriched by technical assistance from the developed countries, and the state is also thought of as having the capability to initiate and pursue programs of development for the benefit of the whole of society. I mean, there is an implicit disjunction between the state and society, slurring over questions about the social foundations of political power and the making of public policy. The problematic of the state is then narrowed down to that of the efficacy of its public institutions and organs to achieve objectives and programs of modernization, focusing especially on the respective roles of ruling elites 1, dominant political parties 2, the bureaucracy 3, and the military 4. And then we have discussed the relationship between the state and society, and how we have discussed theories of modernization are, however, explicitly or implicitly are theories of capitalist development, which are premised on the creation and maintenance of basic structures and institutions of a capitalist society. And it may be contrasted with the notions of revolutionary change, decisive break with the internal structures and the encompassing international framework of global capitalism. I mean, notions of exploitation, oppression, domination and subordination, and antagonism of class interests. And we have discussed how there is a similarity between the theory of capitalist development and the theory of socialist development. I mean, both aim at the dissolution and transformation of pre-capitalist social and economic structures, but the difference lies in terms of their methods. Then we have discussed structures in terms of political system and the state. We have discussed reification, that refers to the process where the result of our actions appears to us as a quasi-natural thing because we do not recognize its social origins or process of creation that goes into its formation. We have discussed economic markets in terms of free competition, foreign direct investment, structural imperatives and so on, and political markets in terms of political entrepreneurs aiming to maximize votes, legislation, the application of laws and authoritative allocations of value. Structural imperatives, I mean the imperative of capitalism, its imperative character lies in the fact that it determines the consequences of all such actions. It makes the new situation successively the basis on which fresh calculations are made and corrective action contemplated. It is to recognize the possibility of disjunction within limits and at particular moments between the making of public policy and the contending interests of the dominant classes, the indigenous bourgeois, the metropolitan bourgeois and landowning classes, as well as the fact that such deviations not only have limits, but cannot persist over a long period of time, for they are soon overtaken by the consequences of such policies, which bring into play forces for an alteration of the course, so that state policies are brought into line with the requirements and demands of peripheral capitalism. I mean capitalism as being practiced and pursued in the less developed countries. Then we have discussed economic determination in the last instance, that allows us to account for the stupidity and miscalculations of different guardians of the state, and for the degree of freedom that they possess in possibly pursuing their own interests by virtue of being in charge of the state apparatus. Then we have discussed fundamental classes, class formation, class alignments, fractions of a single class that is analogous to the division of the bourgeois in advanced capitalist countries into different fractions, such as industrial capital, finance capital and commercial capital. Then we have discussed auxiliary classes, class origins of the bureaucracy. Then we have discussed, after having discussed Hamza Alawi, we have discussed Lilly and how modernization refers to the process of transition from traditional to modern principles of social organization, and this process is currently occurring in Asian, African and Latin American continents. Okay, that is how they have made a distinction between traditional and modern societies, and they have taken the cue from Weber through Parsons, I mean through Parsonian pattern variables, affectivity versus affective neutrality, specificity versus diffuseness, like this. Okay. Then we have discussed Huntington's political order in changing societies, class of civilizations in terms of social science theory, evidence, scientism and as an ideology. Then we have discussed Theodore Sanin's class state and revolution from the vantage point of the radical upsurge of 1968 and its aftermath. I mean, what should be the nature of revolutions, what should be the revolutionary tactics, what should be the revolutionary strategies and so on. We have referred to the Vietnam War during and after 1968, a search for the agencies of revolutionary change and an analysis of the impediments provided the crux of a threefold debate. Okay? I mean prospects of revolution and revolutionary class, 1, revolutionary organizations and their relation to the classes or masses, 2, and state and revolution, I mean the nature of the societies, nature of the state in societies, 3, I mean nature of the state in societies where revolutions have been contained, nature of the state in societies where revolutionary challenge and nature of the state in societies within which a revolution becomes institutionalized. Then we have discussed the political context, and then we have discussed the reflections of Sanin on the empirical peasantry and the hypothetical proletariat. Who has got the potential, which class has got the potential to bring about a social and political revolution. Okay? Then we have discussed revolutionary classes and perspectives, the argument that unfolded within the basic framework of the Marxist tradition, a common commitment to change aimed at abolishing the social base of exploitation and domination. I mean then acceptance of a sociological perspective whose major components are the determining impact of political economy and of class conflict within social structure, and then we have discussed acceptance of revolutionary violence as the probable and indeed usual though not obligatory, way of bringing about the necessary social change. At this point, nevertheless, paths began to diverge. I mean, about revolutionary strategies and revolutionary tactics. The third world as the area where revolutionary conditions are ripe and where revolutions which might develop into socialist ones are in the cards. The industrial working class is increasingly diversified in numbers and sunk in a complacency derived in part from the benefits of the imperial spoils. The main weight of global capitalist exploitation falls most heavily upon the developing societies, in particular on the peasants and the urban poor of peasant background, who together form the major oppressed classes there. The established industrial working class in less developed countries has been privileged in relation to the peasant majority, the poorest urbanites and the unemployed. And then we have discussed how the masses in the exploited dependencies, I mean the underprivileged classes, the peasants, the urban poor, the workers, plus perhaps the intelligentsia, constitute a force in the global capitalist system, which is revolutionary in the sense Marx considered proletariat of the early period of modern industrialization to be revolutionary. Okay? And against this, others stuck to the more orthodox Marxist guns, the most advanced technology, the centers of power and knowledge, which lie in the industrialized societies, and it is therefore from there socialism has to be established around the globe. Socialism will be born from the wombs of capitalism and so on. And it is the social character of the industrial working class, its unity on the shop floor, its skills, I mean acquired in dealing with advanced technology, its size, its propertylessness and its explicit relations of conflict with the capitalists, which make it into the most revolutionary, indeed the only revolutionary and socialist class of our times. That is what the orthodox Marxists suggest. Then, but some of the very premises of the comparison were spurious, as Sanin argued. Then we have discussed political characteristics of empirical peasants with those of empirical industrial workers, rather than attempting to deduce them from a historico-philosophical theory whose supreme virtue consists of being supra-historical. I mean supra-historical, I am borrowing this term from Marx, I mean which goes beyond history, I mean that becomes more irrelevant in fact. We have discussed how peasants in their political struggles tend to fight for land rather than for broader political aims, to be preoccupied with local day-to-day concerns rather than with general long-term aims and complex ideologies. The workers develop nationwide class consciousness and class organization, consequently a class for itself, while the peasants remain disunited and politically naive. The peasants do not control their leaders, they are the object and tool rather than the subject of political action. Then we have discussed Sanin's reflection on class state and revolution model and context, the 1968 wave of revolutionary optimism, revolutionary army. The most pertinent question that Sanin poses, how do revolutions take place and succeed at all, rather than why do revolutions not take place more frequently. Okay, that is how he refers to Lenin, who was well versed in practice, theory and art of revolution. I mean revolutions occur when neither the ruled nor the rulers are able to go on living in the old way. And successful revolutions, they depend upon popular intervention in social structure, property relations, systems of domination, class divisions, typical forms of cognition, transformation of the state and removal of its rulers. Four major crises which were found, I mean a major crisis causing severe dislocation of society and its day-to-day functioning, a major crisis of the governing elite affecting its ability to govern, a crystallization of classes and subclasses expressed in a sharp way, that increase in self-identification, organization and militancy along class lines, and an effective revolutionary organization providing leadership in the political struggle. We have discussed how revolutions are critically embedded in an international context, relevant and often decisive for their outcome. I mean when I say less developed countries, I mean the societies at the underprivileged pole in a world capitalist system of inequalities, with consequences for important features of their internal structures, that indicates a particular kind of state, a particular kind of class system and a particular kind of revolution. Then we have discussed Sanin's class state and revolution through the epiphenomenal state and the substitute bourgeois. Then we have discussed class and classness, I mean 3-stage pattern of development, conservative technology of a handicraft system, the manufacture that was linked to an essentially conservative working class of assembled craftsmen, revolutionary breakthrough in technology and the new social relations introduced by industrialization that gave rise to a massive and homogeneous proletariat and the possibility of a powerful revolutionary push by them might result in revolution. Nevertheless, and when and if revolutions fail to mature, a new situation begins to develop. And thirdly, heterogeneous and differentiated proletariat, occupational and status consciousness tend to submerge class consciousness. Then we have discussed revolutionary potential of industrial working class and peasantry, minorities on the basis of caste, race, ethnicity, nationality, gender and class. I mean the role of intellectuals in industrial societies vis-a-vis developing societies, and thereby we have referred to Gramsci's the role of intellectuals in party building, rationalism, creative freedom, I mean freedom to dissent. Then we have discussed permanent vanguard and revolutionary class, historical necessity of a revolutionary vanguard, and then we have discussed Gramsci's modern prints and Marx and Engels, Marx's and Engels, the manifesto of the Communist Party, class vanguard, interdependence, party cadres, organization, guided class action, in which a class is led and controlled by a revolutionary elite of relative outsiders with their conceptions of reality, organization and corporate interest. Then we have discussed substitutes and realities through the lens of Sanin's reflections on class, state and revolution and so on. Okay. Then we have discussed how theories of modernization, which are essentially theories of capitalist development. We have discussed finding pluriversal paths, breaking the chains of development, I mean finding pluriversal paths through the works of Ashish Kothari, Escobar and others, breaking the chains of development through Nemo Bashe, development for the 1%, Vandana Shiva, Maldevelopment by Jose Maria Tortosa, the development project by Philip McMichael, the Latin American critique of development by Maristelo Swampa, and BRICS, I mean Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa by Ana Garcia and Patrick Bond. Okay. That is how we have discussed, I mean finding pluriversal paths. I mean when I say the political, it is a collaboration among dissenting voices over the kinds of alternative worlds that we want to create. That is how the distinction between the global north and the global south was created. It is not simply about geographical locations, but about economic and geopolitical implications. We have discussed globalization alliances. The misconception is that the development has been conceptualized as linear, unidirectional, material and financial growth driven by commodification and capitalist markets. And we have looked at the works of Marx and Gramsci again. We have discussed limits of developmentalism as it shapes reforming solutions to global crisis, market mechanisms, geoengineering, climate smart agriculture, the population question, green economics, reproductive engineering, transhumanism and so on. Then we have discussed sustainable development, I mean sustainable development goals, transforming our world, the 2030 agenda for sustainable development and the flaws that we have discussed. I mean no analysis of how the structural roots of poverty, unsustainability and multidimensional violence are historically grounded in state power, corporate monopolies, neocolonialism and patriarchal institutions, inadequate focus on direct democratic governance with accountable decision making by citizens and self-aware communities in face-to-face settings, continued emphasis on economic growth as the driver of development contradicting biophysical limits with arbitrary adoption of GDP as the indicator, gross domestic product as the indicator of progress, continued reliance on economic globalization as the key economic strategy, undermining people's attempts at self-reliance and autonomy, and continued subservience to private capital and unwillingness to democratize the market through worker, producer and community control, modern science and technology held up as social panaceas, ignoring their limits and impacts and marginalizing other knowledge, culture, ethics and spirituality sidelined and made subservient to economic forces. Unregulated consumerism without strategies to reverse the global north's, developed world's disproportionate contamination of the globe through waste, toxicity and climate emissions, and neoliberal architectures of global governance becoming increasingly reliant on technocratic managerial values by state and multilateral bureaucracies. Then we have discussed finding pluriversal paths through ecological wisdom, integrity and resilience, social well-being and justice, direct and delegated democracy, economic democratization, cultural diversity and knowledge democracy. Then we have discussed breaking the chains of development by Bassi through Africa, development, colonialism and climate change. Then Vandana Shiva's development only for the 1%, we have through global crisis, capitalist patriarchal logic, economic violence, poverty and oikos. Economics as well as ecology, they have the same Greek roots, which Greek root of oikos meaning home. Then we have discussed maldevelopment through basic needs, maldevelopment, underdevelopment, well-being, freedom, identity, security and so on. Then we have discussed development project through development, climate change and food sovereignty. Then we have discussed the Latin American critique of development through consumerism, underdevelopment, colonial matrix of power, extractivism and so on. Then we have discussed BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa through new development banks and so on, through sub-imperialism, development banks, multilateral reforms and so on. Now, what we are going to do? We are going to look at, in this lecture, we are going to look at the critiques of modernization theory. In terms of 2 lectures, we are going to complete this portion. When you say the critiques of modernization theory, such critiques emanated from 3 important continents, namely Asia, Africa and Latin America. Okay. Theoretically speaking, Latin America was the first to initiate a systematic attack on theories of modernization, which are explicitly or implicitly theories of capitalist development. Here, I am going to bank on 2 important sources. One is by Alex Inkelis, a model of the modern man, theoretical and methodological issues, one. And secondly, I am going to look at, I am going to depend on DC Tips when he looked at modernization theory and the comparative study of societies, a critical perspectives, DC Tips. Okay. This is these are extremely important documents. When I say Alex Inkelis, we will start with Alex Inkelis, then we will discuss DC Tips. The results of Inkelis' latest comparative study of modernity in Argentina, Chile, India, Israel, Nigeria and Pakistan. These 6 countries. Okay. Through them we are going to discuss these 3 models, the analytic model, the topical model and the behavioral model. In the process of studying these 6 modernizing societies, Inkelis has developed a conceptual model of individual modernity based on analytic, topical and behavioral considerations that serves to define the type of personality that one would expect to predominate under conditions of advanced modernization. Okay. Then what are these? The term modern, okay. If I say what is the difference between modernity and being modern? Modernity may be a set of ideologies, may be a set of ethos. On the contrary, being modern, okay. If I say modernity is a set of ethos, maybe a set of ideologies, then being modern is a set of practices, is a set of traits. Okay? That is why the term modern has many associations and carries a heavy weight of connotations. It is applied not only to individuals, but to nations, to political systems, to economies, to cities, to institutions such as schools, hospitals, to housing, to clothes, to manners and so on. Okay. What Inkel is trying to do, he is trying to build a conceptual model of individual modernity. But the great danger in the definition of the modern is that some more powerful group may arbitrarily impose its own traditional values on a less powerful group, as if it were bestowing the same benefit it confers when it offers a railroad network, a television station, a well equipped field hospital, or any one of a dozen other so called miracles of modern technology. Do we not do something peculiar and distorting if we make the American businesses grey flannel suit more modern than the Indian civil servants high necked coat or high necked coat or for that matter their dhoti system? Isn't that it potentially misleading as well as arbitrary to treat monogamy as more modern than polygamy? Indeed, are we not presuming a great deal when we consider the Arab chieftain more modern merely because they replace their camel with a Cadillac or even a small jet plane? The tendency to equate the modern with foreign technology does not prevail only in the West. Okay? Even in Indian context, mistakenly, people are considered more modern if they believe that food cooked on charcoal tastes better than food cooked on other sources and insist that factory clothes feel better on the skin than homespun cloth. Okay? That is how khadi has been sidelined, handlooms have been sidelined in the Indian context by the powers that be. Okay? That is why the analytic model, that the modern individual that Inkel has been trying to foreground, that as you can slightly recall in the initial classes we have discussed the desire for development. We began with the desire to develop a conception of individual as well as collective modernity that did not blindly and arbitrarily oppose Western customs and Western standards of value on the citizens of developing countries. Attaining a value-free measure of modernity is quite difficult, with the exception of Japan perhaps and Russia, precisely because we wish to include it with the East. For the time being, all the major nations we can consider modernized have a European tradition. Thus, it is extremely difficult to disentangle those elements of their social and cultural systems that are distinctive to and necessary for the maintenance of a modern society from those that are really traditional for these European societies, but they have incidentally become associated with in a sense dragged along into the contemporary era along with the more modern institutions. For example, everyone has noted how the Japanese and indeed the elites in most of the underdeveloped world have adopted the Western businessman's suit and their shoes, even though in fact this attire is in no way necessary for the running of a modern society. Our solution to the problem was to avoid an abstract list of values and instead to develop a list of modern qualities that met the demands or requirements of running a factory. We will encounter little argument, we trust, when we propose that the factory is one of the distinctive institutions of modern society. Indeed, industrialization is a very large part of the modernization process. Many would claim that it is the most essential element. Industrialization in turn depends on the factory, the large scale productive enterprise, bringing together large numbers of men in the work of in one workplace systematically ordering their relationship with one another on rational considerations expressed through formal rules, regulations and so on, relying on concentrations and concentrations of inanimate power and the systematic application of technology, and guided by a hierarchy of authority resting largely on technical skill and administrative competence. The factory, which is an institution, has no nationality that way. It is not English, French or Dutch, or for that European or Asian or Indian or so. It does not violate the important taboos of any religious group, major or minor. There are no prescriptions referred to the rules which are bound by law against entering such a place. There are of course many ways at the factory of looking at the factory as an institution. We do not claim that our list of qualities and requirements of factory life is exhaustive or even definitive, but each of the themes is important as an attribute of factory life and is simultaneously a quality of men that has more general relevance for life in a modern society. Okay. That is why it is important to narrow the range and down, we must narrow down the range of themes by focusing particularly on those features of factory organization that we assumed would be notable to and most influence that would most influence a naive worker from the countryside. Okay. If you look at this, you will find that the realm of the growth of opinion represents this area is itself divisible into a number of sub themes or scale areas. If Inkeles, what he tries to do is to define a modern individual, if she or he has a disposition to form or hold opinions over a large number of the problems and issues that arise not only in his immediate environment, but also outside it. Okay. And that is why when this set in contrast to the common individual of traditional society, a modern individual accepts innovation and change, is open to new experience of themselves and those around them. They express their openness in part by valuing formal schooling and believing in the potential benefit of scientific and technological experimentation and exploration. They also express their openness by taking an interest in external affairs, seeking new sources of information about all manner of things, including public events that do not necessarily touch their immediate life. Their involvement and participation in the wider world is reflected in their holding opinions over a wide range of issues, in their tolerance for differing opinions, and in their respect for the right to an opinion by those weaker and less prestigious than they are. The more modern individual has a greater sense of efficacy. They feel less dominated by fate and are more convinced that individuals, by their own efforts and by combining their efforts with others, can organize to master nature and arrange social affairs to assure mankind a reasonable degree of security from calamity, conflict, disease and hunger. This sense of efficacy rests in part on a feeling of confidence or trust in their associates, a sense of calculability of organizations, superiors, co-workers and subordinates, and of the reasonable certainty that they will fulfill their obligations to them. The feeling assures them of the support they require for performing their share of the common task. Planning for them is a highly valued way of attaining both their personal goals and the collective tasks in which they participate. Intimately associated with this value is a strict sense of time and an insistence on the importance of the careful scheduling of events. The modern individual expects to receive rewards in accordance with their skill and their relative contribution to the common effort, and for their part they acknowledge the value of education and technical skill and are prepared to see them rewarded proportionately. but they feel that these rewards should be part of a formal system governed by rules universally applied and not restricted to particular individuals and special circumstances according to accident or the whims of the powerful. Correspondingly, in their treatment of others, especially those weaker or less important than they, they are aware of and avoid diminishing the sense of dignity, personal worth of those under their care and control. To begin, I mean, our formulation of the dimensions of modernity, in fact, the very dimensions that is necessarily somewhat arbitrary. Thus, we are quite ready to acknowledge that the theme of calculability might better be expressed as trust. Indeed, the items by which we measure calculability suggest as much. Furthermore, the logical and empirical distinctiveness of some of the dimensions must be examined. Equally, it may be argued that the sense of efficacy and the belief in planning both are facets of one more general underlying dimension. However clear and appropriate our conception of any dimension of modernity, our effort to measure it may be inadequate. Thus, it may be quite sound to consider the readiness of new experience characteristic of modern individuals. But asking an individual if they would move to a strange land may not be much of a test of their openness to new experience. Although we were quite confident that you will find that we may be correct in our assumptions about some of the dimensions we have that we have narrated just now, we may still be wrong in our most fundamental assumption that all the dimensions relate to each other as a syndrome of characteristics we can sensibly label modern individual. For example, Professor Dipankar Gupta, who is Professor Emeritus at the Center for Center for the Study of Social Systems in Jawaharlal Nehru University, JNU in New Delhi. In the late 90s, he wrote a book, Mistaken Modernity, that he said, who is modern? His first opinion was that dignity of the individual is a marker of modernity. Accountability in public life is a marker of modernity. Achievement must displace ascribed qualities is a marker of modernity. Okay? These are the interesting points of intellectual and political departure that one must try to understand. Okay? The analytic model of modernization is maybe bizarre or even terribly unorthodox. Although derived by a different process and following its own path from an initial concern with the factory as an organization, Inkel's analytic model includes many elements in common with those of other students of modernization who began from other starting points and were guided by different theoretical concerns. The list is certainly more ramified than most, and the research does perhaps give greater emphasis to certain themes such as the sense of efficacy or the openness to new experience. Nevertheless, the lists are basically similar. We are perhaps somewhat different in their insistence that the elements of the model hold together as a coherent syndrome of modern attitudes, but this idea is also implicit in the approaches of many of the scholars who have thought extensively about individual modernization. The basic distinction therefore is that Inkels and others have not been content only to define the qualities of modern individual. They have gone beyond this idea to render their definition operational by converting it into a set of specific calculable measures. and then they have gone further still in subjecting their ideas to an empirical set of several different cultures simultaneously to ascertain how far individuals in nature do approximate their model of the modern individual, and to determine the forces that make individuals more modern. Then coming to the topical model, the analytic model of the modern individual is derived primarily from a theoretical consideration of the requirements of factory life. The components were selected because they were assumed to cohere as a psychological syndrome. Okay. While not arbitrary, such a conception is clearly limited and highly selective. Scholars studying the modernization process as it involves the individual often point to quite a few other problems as central issues. Some of these factors are identified as preconditions of modernization, that is, the assumption is made that unless these issues can be solved, a society's successful attainment of modernization will remain highly problematic, and others are identified as the accompaniment. Others are identified as the accompaniments of consequences of modernization, the price in a sense that people pay for obtaining the benefits, such as they are of entering the modern world. Each problem has its own sponsors, as it were individuals who have particularly devoted their energies to its explication and investigation. In some instances, their argument rests on a global deal of evidence, in others it is merely an assertion of opinion, however plausible. Some of these problems were of special interest to one or more individuals to satisfy their interest. Each of these problems that we are trying to look at, if you look at M.B. Deshmukh's report on the migrant communities in Delhi, where Deshmukh observed the absence of social beginning, the pressure of poverty and the evil effects of the urban environment made the family bonds regarded to be so sacred in the villages of absolutely no importance in the migrant colonies. Okay. If you look at the topical model, Inkel's tries to look at women's rights, birth control, religion, the aged, okay, politics, information media, consumption, social stratification, psychic adjustment. Okay. If you look at these components starting from women's rights, which are intimately related to the changing pattern of family relations, the public policy that the state formulates, but broader than this is the question of the status of women in our economy, in our culture, in our polity. Most of the traditional societies and communities of the world are, if not strictly patriarchal, at least vigorously male dominated. The extreme example perhaps is found in certain societies, certain cultures, certain political setups. The liberating influence of the forces making for modernization would act on men's attitudes and incline them to accord to women's status and rights more nearly equal to those enjoyed by men. Okay. Inkel's tried to test the men's orientation through questions on a woman's right to work and to equal pay, to hold public office and to freely choose her marriage partner. When you look at birth control, few points about contemporary world have been better documented than the fact that in many underdeveloped countries population is increasing rapidly as to equal and sometimes exceed the rate at which the supply of food and other necessities increases. I mean, when he looks at this population problem, in fact has turned out to be a myth that people very often say that no, just because of our population, a huge population, poverty increases also, but actually that is not the case. Okay. Even if your population will be very small, our country may suffer from poverty, precisely because of the uneven distribution of wealth and resources. The right to food, perhaps they have not been institutionalized. Coming to religion, as an epistemological vantage point must be studied, but the way you will find that religion has been used as part of obligation, as part of fundamentalism and so on, perhaps must be avoided in the topical model. The aged, the special role of the aged is intimately linked to the strength of the family and the vigor of religion in most traditional settings. I mean, the concept of gerontology and so on. On the issue of the aged, I mean, as on the family and religious issues, it seemed clear that structural changes accompanying modernization must certainly undercut the special position of the aged. In the era of technological revolution, for example, it would be hard for the village elder relying on their long personal experience to preserve their authority indefinitely in competition with the agricultural expert relying on the latest scientific advances. Coming to politics, political modernization has been cited by many scholars as an indispensable condition of the modernization of economy and society. To characterize the citizen of a modern polity, the word participant is often used. If you slightly recall, we have discussed what are the political indicators of development, participation and mobilization. Okay. That is why whenever we try to characterize the citizen of a modern polity, the word participant is often used, as is the word mobilized. There is an expectation that the citizen of a modern polity will take an active interest not only in those matters that touch their immediate life, but also in the larger issues facing their community. Their allegiance is supposed to extend beyond their family and friends to the state and the nation and its leaders. They are expected to join political parties, to support candidates and to vote in elections. Okay. Coming to information media, it is extremely important to create awareness. Consumption, when I say we must go beyond the conventional notion of consumption as the destruction of utility, because utility is the want satisfying power of a commodity is the one that has got more exchange value. We have to go beyond this conventional notion of consumption. It is not also like this that the more you consume, the more developed you are. It is also not like that. Okay. When you say consumption, how consumption has been socially, economically, culturally, ethically, legally, institutionally, they are distributed. Okay. And that is how, when it comes to the aspect of distribution, you look at the aspect of social stratification. Okay. Traditional societies are generally defined as having closed class systems. In the extreme poorest of a rigid class structure, mobility is minimal. Individuals are born into the positions in which they die. I mean, then the social stratification which is based on birth, social stratification which is based on caste, race, gender, class and so on. One must try to look at status, power, prestige and so on. One must try to look at this, and that is how our modern psychology's minds, they also get affected. Okay. Now, coming to the behavioral model, if you look at this behavioral model, sociology is often charged with being too abstract, divorced from the current concrete reality of social life, which is actually not correct. Even when, I mean, the behavioral measures are extremely important models of individual modernity. The self-reported behavioral measures were those on which the subject rated herself or himself, in effect by stating that she or he did or did not do certain things. Okay. What Ingalls tries to look at through these through this behavioral model, they are the objective measures of behavior obtained through certain questionnaire were supplemented by information from outside sources, notably the subject's factory. The problems inherent in collecting such information obliged them to restrict the investigation to a subsample of the factory workers in each country. Okay. The three models that we have discussed, the analytic model, the topical model and the behavioral model, okay, guided the thinking on research that took shape, and their mark is therefore clearly visible in the content of this such distinctions, which are emphasized by the three models, were useful in assuring reasonable thoroughness in the selection of themes within each area, yet they prevented them for taking too narrow a view of the process of modernization. The distinctions among the models viewed as dependent variables permitted them to be much more precise in deciding which influences to study among those generally assumed to generate modernity. Taken together, the three models serve therefore as a convenient organizing principle within which to encompass the considerable diversity of the various themes and areas, and indeed useful as the models might be in organizing thinking, they do introduce some artificial or at least arbitrary divisions not necessarily found in nature. The models lead us to separate into three parts, some realms that might perfectly well be seen as more coherently joined in one. Okay. What applies to any one realm can indeed apply to all the dimensions taken together. That is how you can look at overall modernity and so on. Then what we are going to do, what we have discussed, today we have discussed three models of three conceptual models of individual modernity, namely the analytic model, analytic model of model and the modern individual, the topical model, women's rights, birth control, religion, the aged, politics, information media, consumption, social stratification and psychic adjustment. Then the behavioral model. What we are going to do in the next lecture, we are going to discuss in a more striking manner a critique of modernization theory. Why is it important? What Levy suggested, what Square suggested, what Eisenstadt suggested, and it is not simply a type of change, but also a type of response to change. Okay. Then we will discuss in terms of critical variable approaches and dichotomous approaches, how Levy and Squares they forge the critical variable approaches precisely because they tend to equate modernization with a single type of change and so on, and then how the concept of modernization in the how the concept of modernization is closely related to Weber's rationalization in terms of economic organization, in terms of religion, law, politics, moral behavior, science and society. Then we will discuss dichotomous approach through the works of Mind, Tonis, Durkheim and others, especially Sumner, okay, and how dichotomous approaches are the product of an essentially ethnocentric worldview that Sumner wrote in Folkways in 1906. And when we say modern, we must be modern, we must be Western without the onus of dependence on the West. Okay? We will try to discuss a threefold critique of the dichotomous approaches to modernization theory, the ideological critique, the empirical critique, and the methodological or meta-theoretical critique. I mean, how ethnocentrism is based on, I mean, it has been used by, was coined by Sumner, William Graham Sumner, to describe prejudicial attitudes between in-groups and out-groups, by which our attitudes, customs, and behavior are unquestionably and uncritically treated as superior to their social arrangements. And that is how we have created these binaries: civilized versus barbarism, traditional versus modern, okay, rural versus urban, and so on, precisely because it is based on regime of the biological school of the evolutionary theory. And how American hegemony has been responsible for this, for the spread of modernization theory across continents through a widespread attitude of complacency towards American society and the expansion of American political, military, and economic interests throughout the world. Then we will discuss the empirical critique. We will look at especially Clifford Geertz, the interpretation of cultures, empirical inadequacy of modernization theory in the form of either an erroneous or misleading empirical assertion that has incorporated into itself the conceptual framework or of a critical range of phenomena which it has overlooked. Then we will discuss how modernization theory fails to incorporate such significant variables such as the impact of war, conquest, colonial domination, international political and military relationships, international trade, cross-national flow of capital, and so on, and the problem in the notion of traditional society and the distinction between traditional and modern societies. Then we will discuss tradition and modernity, how they represent two mutually exclusive, functionally interdependent clusters of attributes. And then the methodological or meta-theoretical critique, when we will discuss how it focuses upon the underlying strategy of conceptualization involved in modernization theory and its usefulness, and how it focuses directly upon the central issue raised by the choice between the revisionist and radical alternatives. We will discuss this in the next class. I mean, there is a perennial tension between the logical requirements of comparability and explanation, and how the proponents of modernization theory have chosen to resolve this tension in the direction of comparability, not in the direction of explanation, which the Marxist theory of development or the Latin American critics of modernization paradigm, they have looked into. And then we will in the next lecture we are going to discuss this. Okay? Thank you.